and welcome to On Topic. This is the Bloomberg Opinion Show in which we unpack the major news of the moment. My name is Ghosh. I'm your host, and I come to you from New York City. And I'm delighted today to be joined by my colleagues from the far side of the planet, Karishma Vaswani in Singapore. Hi, Karishma.
Hi, Bobby. Great to see you. Great to be here.
And from much closer at hand, from Washington, D.C., Andreas Kluth. Hi, Andreas.
Hi, Bobby.
I have assembled this high-powered pairing of foreign policy experts to discuss the major foreign policy event, I think, of the past week, which is the expansion of BRICs. The BRICs gathering in South Africa made an announcement that expected, but still quite striking. Karishma, since you've been up longer than either Andreas or me, can you bring us up to date with the
Sure.
news from the weekend?
Yeah, I mean, I've been up longer than the two of you. I don't know how much more coherent I am. It's a little past 9 o'clock in the evening here in Singapore, but I will do my best to try and sum up what we saw happen last week. BRICS met, as you pointed out, Bobby, and came up with an invitation for 6 other members to join. And those countries, had been talked about for some time, of course. There had been so much speculation about the 40 or so that had been rumored on this mysterious list that were clamoring, apparently, it was claimed, to join BRICS as well. But in the end, the invitations were sent to Argentina, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. So BRICS, which is, of course, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, now has to come up in the first instance with another unwieldy acronym, frankly, Bobby. And as one foreign policy expert put it to me last week, the big surprise was the fact that there was actually anything that happened at all at BRICS, because typically these sorts of meetings don't end up culminating in anything particularly substantial. And I have to say, I did try and get through the 25-page or so communique that the group came out with at the end of their summit. And one thing is really clear, and Andreas, I think this is something that you touched on in one of your columns as well. This is an organization that doesn't really know what it's about. It was sort of formed in a way to counter the United States or Western hegemony, if you will. But there are so many conflicting motivations here that it's hard to see how it could be anything of substance.
Yes, indeed. And what was your impression looking on from Washington, D.C.? And what was the impression of people around you in Washington, D.C. foreign policy circles?
Exactly how Karishma described it, that this is a block, this is a meeting of people trying to be a block and not convincing anybody that they're even a block. It's an acronym. It started as an acronym. Jim O'Neill, Goldman Sachs in 2001, came up with the term for investors, like, put your money in these markets, they might be up and coming. That's the only thing they had in common. That's still, as far as I'm concerned, the only thing they have in common, except for one other thing, which is we're going to get into it, which is a dislike of what, let's say, as they would put it, U.S. hegemony or the Western-led order, whatever that means. And many countries share that. So now they're going to try to make up in strength of numbers by inviting more members what they lack in cohesion. That there is nothing, this is not a European Union or a United States of anything in the making. There are a lot of blocks out there. They all have more in common, these other blocks, than this one. For example, I think good for them that there was briefly talk that they might try to start their own currency, which is completely ridiculous. That'll never happen, and now even less so. So they have nothing in common except a dislike of the Western order, and they will not be ever the alternative to that. That doesn't mean we shouldn't take it seriously, but that's my take on it.
Yeah, and just on that, Andreas and Bobby, if you don't mind if I just jump in there, I think, the other thing that unites them in a way, besides the fact that they are to some degrees in varying forms, right? Because India, I don't think you can sort of outright say has a dislike of the Western order. It has this sort of ambivalence. It's trying to figure itself out, but at the same time, it wants to be invited to every party in town, right? Having its own foreign and active policy. I think what is really interesting is that perhaps in the formation of this group, and they were banded together by that moniker, as Andreas rightly pointed out, there was an ambition to be like the Bandung Conference of 1955, this idea that they could be part of a non-aligned movement, a non-aligned world. But how, I find that really, open to skepticism, because how can a country like China claim to be non-aligned, or any of the nations within this grouping as well, but particularly Beijing? And I think one of the reasons why there's so much reluctance to join, as we've seen some countries sort of be a little bit, anxious about joining, Indonesia is one good case in point, is because they're not entirely sure what the motivations behind this grouping are. And that goes to the point that Andreas was making, that really, a BRICS currency, you've got two countries who are rivaling one another, China and India. They can't seem to agree on very much. How are they supposed to agree on a currency? It does stretch the imagination a bit.
Well, actually, it's what talking about that currency going into this gathering in South Africa, and for some time now, there's been talk, that's how I would characterize it, about a currency alternative, a global currency alternative to the dollar, that BRICS, because of the sheer scale of some of the core members, India and China, the platform from which a currency might evolve. I'm going to quote David Frum, a writer at the this sort of very arch but very telling comment, and this was before the summit. He says, if you combine Brazil's history of monetary stability, property rights, India's domestic tranquility, China's currency, and South Africa's investment opportunities, hey presto, you've got a new global currency. I mean, and then if you look at the nature of the new members, with the exception of Saudi Arabia and the UAE, economic basket cases. Argentina, ironically, in the new group that is rated as a full-fledged democracy, although with the is going right this moment, that will be the case. This is not of a credible gathering of countries, Karishma, that could put out that could support and back alternative to the dollar.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Bobby. And I do think it is worth picking up on that first question right at the beginning. I think that, you were sort of ruminating over that. If indeed this organization is as, bereft of a goal or a unifying force as it is, why is it so appealing to so many countries? Why has it become this sort of de facto alternative to the current world order? And I do think there is a sincere desire in a post-colonial world, if you will, where countries that are in the developing world, in the emerging world rather, I should say, the rise of the rest, right? That want a bigger seat at the table. They want to have a say in how institutions like the IMF and the World Bank are operating, or what, the United Nations Security Council should do, and literally having a bigger seat at the table for some of these nations like India at that particular table. And I think that's a genuine desire. And I don't think that's being addressed properly by the Western world. I mean, I have so many conversations with diplomats and Asian government officials out here in this part of the world. And obviously, nobody wants a polarized world either, right? Like, nobody's hankering for the US and China to consistently be at loggerheads with one another. But I do think there is a sort of, inherent need to feel and be more important in these global institutions. And I think that's why BRICS, for lack of anything else, has become interesting to these countries.
And is that the perception in the West? Is that the perception in Washington and in Europe? Moved from. Does the Western world recognize this point that Karishma is making, which is very well taken, that even at the absurdity of the formation of BRICS, that underneath a genuine sense of grievance in the global South? Does the West recognize that? Is the West making any attempts to address them?
Well, first of all, the sense of grievance in the global south is real. So the people in the West, which is there even such a thing as the West or the global south? But let's say there's a West from Australia to Europe and the US. Some of these foreign policy people, the wonks, will be aware that there is this sense of grievance in the global south, in particular over, because it's written about in Foreign Affairs and long essays about, for instance, their perception of hypocrisy. The West has been, the US has been hypocritical in many ways. So they're upset. Does that mean people around here are aware of it aside from the small circle? No, I don't think they are. So this is something that actually the three of us did a moment ago gang up against the BRICs and kind of smirk at it. That shouldn't mean, as I think also the three of us also happen to agree, it's always problematic when the three of us agree too much, but that shouldn't mean that we shouldn't reform the United Nations Security Council or the IMF or any of these institutions so that these other countries don't keep feeling they have to found redundant alternatives, other like World Bank 2.0. That's what they're, for instance, trying to do. This will be difficult, but for instance, then you have to talk to people like Emmanuel Macron and his successors and French presidents in general are not happy if you point out to them that the United Nations Security Council looks like the colonial and victorious powers just after World War II. And then a lot of these countries now interested in joining the BRICS and all these other blocks where they're colonies. Yeah. And are now having coups and kicking them out and throwing themselves into the arms of the Russians. Why are they doing that? Well, it make sense to have France and the UK as permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, but not these other population giants? That doesn't make sense. So we have to talk about that. As soon as we do talk about that in earnest, I think there will be much less enthusiasm for this vogue of new blocks.
Yeah, no, I agree, and as Andreas very succinctly put it, there's a danger that because what we're saying makes so much sense, obviously we are going to agree with each other because we are rational people that are, coming to similar conclusions. But it is worth, I think, reflecting on the fact that we understand BRICS is an institution that doesn't do very much or hasn't done very much, but it speaks to the ambitions of countries that are hoping to get more out of it. What I found particularly interesting was even though it has set itself up as a de facto to, as you rightly point out, what is the West, but to the West, there were some countries who said, look, not right now for me. And Bobby, as you know, I'm from Indonesia. I grew up in Indonesia. It's a country that I pay a lot of attention to. It's a very important player in this part of the world. And it's in that unique position, like so many Asian countries are, of being, stuck between the US and China. It's sort of the ideal candidate in many ways because it has a lot of similarities with India in terms of a vast population, difficult to govern, etc. So the decision coming out of Jakarta this week to sort of hold back and say, not right now, I found particularly interesting. And I think one of the reasons behind that is because of how BRICS, with China in it, even though China is, the big economic star in many ways, China makes BRICS so much more problematic these days. Not when it was first formed, because back then China was like, savior of the global financial crisis. It was the biggest kid on the block. Everybody wanted to be China's friend. But the economy is slowing down, and I'm not going to be writing off China's economy here. Far too many people have done that in the past and been burned in the future, but it's definitely seeing a slowdown. And I think that's why countries are a little bit more hesitant to sort of throw their lot in with a club, into a club that looks like effectively Beijing is calling the shots in.
Yeah, if I may add to that, Bobby.
Go ahead.
No, the China, as Karishma said, is the problem. I mean, Russia, they're all in their own ways problematic. If you have one member, Vladimir Putin, who can't even attend because he'd have to be arrested at the airport because there's an arrest warrant by the International Criminal Court, that's problematic too. But China is problematic from the point of view of, for example, a South Africa or Brazil or an Indonesia, I would think, or anyone watching, because of its presumed motivation. Because I can buy that South Africa and Brazil want to have a non-West, not an anti-West, but a non-West bloc. But everyone assumes that China wants to have its own bloc, which will dominate because it keeps doing that. That was the point behind the Belt and Road Initiative. That was the thing in Eastern Europe of the thing called 16+1, where China was the +1. It became the 17+1. Now it's the 16, or maybe even by now the 15+1, because countries are realizing, no, China wants to dominate us. That's Xi Jinping's big strategic mistake. He comes across as a bully, and now as a bully whose economy is also possibly collapsing. So that's not good, and that's why I think a lot of countries will want, they don't want to be dominated by the US and the hypocritical West, but they don't want to be dominated by China either. And in particular, India won't want to be. And I saw a headline yesterday that they apparently talked, Modi and Xi, they want to tone down their border disputes. Well, good luck. They have no interest. When they look at these two big ponds, the Indian Ocean and the Pacific, they will not, and then the mountains between them, the Himalayas, there is nothing that they're going to be on the same side of.
I mean, it's interesting to me, you mentioned Brazil and South Africa, Andreas, that this expansion is in South Africa have voted themselves out of having a real serious voice, because once you have Arabia and Egypt, two very large countries, and you have the UAE, deep pockets, the voices of some of the original members are going to essentially fade. I mean, Brazil is has a economic problem as well as a political division that is not properly healed. South Africa is an economic basket case with serious political problems and a sort of foundational political party that is in complete free fall. These countries were struggling to be heard above India, Russia, China. Now into the sidelines, no?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's definitely the risk, and something that countries who perhaps might look to join BRICS in the future will be watching very closely. Just how much of a voice do smaller countries end up having in this organization, which, already has these outsized players and as you point out, now has more of them. But what I think we will see a trend of, whether or not it's within BRICS or not, is more countries looking to tie forces or join forces together in sort of smaller, this idea of this multipolar world, right? Well, if maybe BRICS doesn't do it, there will be other ways for these countries to find a voice. And I think, Bobby, I was saying this to you a little earlier. I went to a really interesting lecture, caveats withstanding, with the Prime Minister of Qatar, who was in Singapore last week, and he was talking about what small states need to do to survive. And it's precisely this. They need to band together. They need to find an organization where their voices are heard, that they're not sort of, struck out or silenced by bigger voices, because that's the only way they're going to survive in a world that increasingly looks like it's being carved up or split between the two sides of the United States and China.
But then don't those organizations already exist? Andreas, there's ASEAN, there's Mercosur, there's in Western Africa, the African Union. There are all kinds of different gatherings of countries that are West, shall we say. Have 800-pound gorillas in the room like China. We need yet another one.
The multiplicity of these, they're not acronyms technically, they're abbreviation soups, but they're the multiplicity of these things, and I listed some of them almost semi-humorously in my column, shows you that none of them has worked. As far, turn it around and think of which blocks do you know that are genuinely successful? And then everyone would, the first one to mention is the EU, but as you know, I've covered the EU. For me, it is a very problematic bloc. It's a confederation that wanted to become a federation and never will, and now is stuck in between and doesn't. And it tried the currency. It's the only one, and that's not really gone well for most of the time and may yet break apart. So aside from the EU, which by the way had a positive message, not at the beginning when it started, but of a peace project between countries that have been at war with each other and then saw something in common. What is the positive message of these other blocs? And in particular of this one, it's a negative message of we're not the West, and we don't, we want to be different, and we want a different world. but there is no positive message. You cannot have a positive, that like a soft power terms, a positive message of BRICS when one member can't arrive because there's an arrest warrant against him. The other is an autocracy. One claims to be a democracy but is backsliding. So is the next one. You know, there is no positive message that could unite them. Or any of these blocks that you mentioned, ECOWAS, for instance, you just mentioned that. They're trying to figure out how to deal with all these coups around them and whether they should invade. And they seem to have agreed, no, they're not going to do anything about the coup, which is probably smart because they probably couldn't. But they're toothless.
Yeah, and there's not even a real trade pact, or not even sort of talk of a trade pact between these countries. Or, and I think this is, there's not really. Although, Karishma, I want you to come in on this. I've been listening over the weekend to a lot of podcasts, reading a lot about BRICS, and podcast exactly, but there was it was brought up that BRICS might serve for India and China that the EU did for France and Germany, which is that it can serve as a peace mission, that perhaps this is the platform in which India and China can kiss. What do you make of that?
I wonder, what did you do when you heard that statement, Bobby? Did you laugh out loud while you were listening to it on your podcast?
I was glad that I was not drinking my coffee at that time.
I mean, yeah, exactly. The reaction from me is like, you know, let's be honest here, right? Like, these two countries are not going to kiss and make up anytime soon. I don't think BRICS is the forum in which they're going to do that either. We've already seen with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that, you know, is another sort of toothless organization. It's highly ineffective. And when these two countries get together for what looks like a convenient photo op, which I think was precisely what it was last week, it's really about the symbolism of these organizations more than anything else. And just to pick up on what Andreas said, yes, I do think that in function, they are ineffective. But I do actually think that the symbolism of having these groups is quite important. And I know that might sound a bit contradictory, right? Like, why have the big sort of pomp and ceremony of getting people in countries to meet once a year, and when actually they're not getting anything done? I mean, you could say the same thing about ASEAN. But the fact that ASEAN came together, and I think it's a good template for other institutions that are looking to try and work together in this way, because, you know, in some respects, they have been able to achieve some things after a varying degree of time. But I think the symbolism of being part of these groups does matter to the countries that are in them, and also as role models for this idea that there is an alternative world. Because, you know, right at the beginning, when Andreas, you were saying in the foreign policy circles in DC, not many people are thinking about this, many people are talking about it. Well, why not? When the rest of the world out here is thinking, we want something else. You know, I'm reflecting what I've heard and what people have said to me. So how come it's not being taken, you know, more seriously in these circles? And if not, we'll find our own way, which is kind of what they've done.
It's interesting that, you know, if this represent the non-West or appeal to the non-West, it doesn't seem to really have struck a chord in Eastern Europe, which is also the non-West. That's a continent that North America is not represented. You could understand that because the United States, gravitational pull the United States sort of has on its neighbors in North America is too strong. But Eastern Europe, surely there must be countries in Eastern Europe that, if nothing else, would like to have a talking shop where they can go, even as purely for symbolic reasons.
But that shows you how subjective and these perceptions, these narratives are. Eastern Europe, with the possible exception of Hungary at the moment, Eastern Europe will be very mad at you now, Bobby, and you're going to get hate mail because they very much see themselves as part of the West, since they were on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain, and then they rejoined it with a vengeance, and they want to get into the other. For instance, Poland, they're having an election later this year. They love Trump even up to a point, but they want to be in bed with NATO and the Americans more than with Brussels and the EU. They don't like that bloc, but they want to be part of the other West. And why? Because with the possible exception of Hungary, they are right next to this Ukrainian-Russian conflict and see the world in a Manichaean black and white way. And that's precisely the conflict that the global South or these BRICS countries don't want to take sides in, except for Vladimir Putin, obviously, right? That's precisely the one where they're saying, "Oh, you guys are hypocritical when we have these problems, and then you don't care. But because it's in Europe now, you want us to take sides. No, we won't." Well, from Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, try that there. They're firmly in the West. They know exactly where they belong. There's no question about not trying to trying to unseat U.S. hegemony or anything else. It's the more U.S., the better.
Yeah, I mean, to go around in every one of these gatherings, there are fundamental hypocrisies across the board. But okay, we've got 4 minutes left. All this problem, where, between the two of you, I'm sure it's within your capacity. What if we can agree? If we agree, and we seem to agree that BRICS is not the solution, what is the solution? What in the existing organizations, United Nations, just pick one. What needs to address some of these concerns that the BRICS are attracted to the BRICS idea? What needs to happen? Karishma, you go first.
Yeah, I'm going to steal from Andreas, so I hope you don't mind, but it's about getting Emmanuel Macron and those kinds of leaders to say, you know what, the world is changing. And the organizations like the G7, the United Nations Security Council, the IMF, the World Bank, all of these places need to reflect the new world that we're in, not a world of 50, 60, 70 years ago. And I think if you see that, if you see a genuine desire to change and to reflect that, then these kinds of institutions that are sort of, built around the idea of a China world or a non-Western world, you may not find them to be that appealing anymore, because the desires of the rest, right, that rise of the rest phrase from Fareed Zakaria so long ago, those are being addressed, and those grievances are being taken seriously. And when they are, people feel a genuine desire, or rather a genuine sense that they are important and they're being listened to. That's what I would think would step.
Andreas, would expanding the Security Council do it?
Absolutely. Well, expanding, but also I don't think it makes sense for 2 medium-sized European nations to be in it. Okay, you could give 1 seat to the EU maybe, but absolutely expand it and reform it in other ways. I would also place my bets if there's so many blocks, I'd like to do more of the G20, because we're all in that together and we can do a lot more there. Stepping back, I think we should try to think less in blocks and more in terms of WTO freer trade. The fashion at the moment, because of here in this town, Washington, D.C., because of this confrontation with China, is to carve up the world. But actually, we should try to have both investment and trade, so trade and capital flows that work in favor, in these countries' favor. They have genuine, valid points there. And the third, I think, reciprocity. I think we can't expect them to take sides in an important, the crucial European conflict that may decide world order, when we don't also in turn invest our entire energy and political capital in some of these, in the Sahel region, for instance. So we have to take their conflicts and problems as seriously as we want them to take ours. I'm a little bit pessimistic that will actually happen, but I think if things go well, that's how the debate goes.
What do you?
Well, Bobby, this is a bit flippant, but again, something that I said to you a little earlier. And, when you look at the formation of the BRICS and what they were supposed to represent, in some ways, they have already achieved that goal. They've drawn attention to this part of the world that at the time was seen as rising and emerging and exciting because of the potential of economic growth. And in many ways, they've sort of served their purpose. Now they've got these new countries joining and, they've got to come up with a new acronym, haven't they? which is going to be a real mouthful. I mean, I've got some ideas, but I won't share them in this call. I'll send
let's
them
hear.
to you.
Oh no, you have to. You
Oh,
promise.
okay.
You
Well,
tease
since
us.
you asked, since you asked, I was going to go for easier BRICS. I don't think it's going to catch on, right?
No, I wouldn't have thought that ECOWAS would have caught on, but here we are. We can give our listeners and readers, if you can come up with a catchy acronym, share it with us on our Twitter account @opinion. I want to thank my guests this morning, Karishma, Singapore, and
No worries.
Andreas. Thank you as always for joining us from Washington. All our listeners and viewers for joining us. As always, as you already probably know by now, we do these conversations every day on a wide range of topics on Twitter or X. Is the handle to find out upcoming live streams. Go to twitter.com, forgive me, go to bloomberg.com/opinion, read Karishma's terrific columns and Andreas's on
And yours.
BRICS on this, well, that's too kind. On a range of other topics, we've got lots of smart colleagues around the world writing on many of the most important issues of our time. Please do read them and come back next Monday for another topic. Thank you all very much.